Now I invite you to hear the gospel, the good news, according to Matthew. After the Sabbath day, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake. For an angel, a messenger of the Lord, descended from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has been raised from the dead, and indeed is going ahead of them into Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. And Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Garrison Keillor, in his Prairie Home Companion, tells the story of a Thanksgiving home gathering in rural Minnesota. He was a part of it. The whole family had gathered around this large table with a beautiful roasted huge turkey as the centerpiece. He said someone made the mistake of asking Uncle John to offer the prayer of blessing. He said anyone should have known that if you ask Uncle John to pray, that somewhere in that prayer, invariably, he's going to talk about the cross of Jesus and Jesus' sacrificial death on our behalf. And he'll start crying, invariably. And Keillor says, you know how awkward that can be when a grown person is crying in the room and no one else is crying. He said we would stand there and we would stare down at the floor while Uncle John cried. We'd shift our weight from foot to foot, and some would get a little white-knuckled. We were all so uncomfortable. And then Keillor was quick to add his observation. All of us there, we knew that Jesus had died on the cross. But Uncle John had never gotten over it. We've heard the old story for so long. Have we gotten over it? Even our Easter celebrations can be somewhat routine. We've heard the story before. Is it really going to make any difference in how you're going to live your life tomorrow? To hear again the message of the heralds of God that Jesus has been raised from the dead. I say today that for those who open their heart to the message and embrace it, it'll make a monumental difference, a world of difference. Remembering that it's those who embrace the message and let it change their life and their viewpoint of this world and life itself that have transformational experiences. Remember the words that I read earlier in the service from the book of Acts, where that writer says that the resurrected Jesus didn't appear to everyone. He didn't appear to the Caiaphas and the Pilates of this world. He appeared to those who had followed Him, who had opened their hearts to His message about the kingdom of God, who had faith in Him. And these early disciples, for sure, they hadn't gotten over the death of Jesus. I think it's very important for us to really celebrate Easter aright, to recall and to remember just how dark and hopeless the first Easter day began. These disciples were absolutely plunged into hopelessness and despair. They were crushed emotionally. They had put their whole life and hopes in Jesus of Nazareth, that He was God's anointed one, that would rise up in their midst and become Messiah, and would set up then and now a reign and rule of God's righteousness with the Romans out of their country. And now their hopes had been dashed and smashed, and they were plunged into darkness. It's important to remember that Easter was not born in the brightness of day that we enjoy in this worship service, with festive music and brightness and flowers and joy. The first Easter was born in the darkness of despondency and death and anguish. And when these women came early to the tomb, they were in darkness emotionally. Perhaps for whatever reason, you're in the darkness right now with some great challenge. It's common to the human experience. And it may be very difficult for you to see beyond the obstacle, to see beyond the darkness that envelops you. Martin Luther, hundreds of years earlier, went through a period of several days where he was experiencing in his life a deep darkness of depression and despondency. And after a few days of this, his wife descended the stairs of their home dressed in black mourning garments. And Martin Luther looked at her and said, "Well, who has died?" And she said, "God has died." And he said, he was upset by it and agitated. "What do you mean God has died? God can't die." And she said, "Well, the way you've been acting around here lately, I sure thought God was dead. You weren't expecting God to do anything on your behalf to help you through this." Today I proclaim to you gladly that God is at work in the darkness. In your darkness. As He was in the darkness experienced by those early disciples. In the upper room devotional for today, the writer says that the Easter story as it's communicated, we don't have to understand how it happened. There are no details how God did what He did. That we don't have to understand how God works in order for God to work. God is at work, the author said, when we can't see God at work, when we're not aware of it. God is working His purposes. God is working for good in people's lives. And as Easter shows us, He does it in surprising and incredible ways. No one expected that God would do what He did for Jesus on that first Easter morning. Can you imagine anything darker than a sealed, blackened tomb where Jesus' body lay? It was in that depth of darkness that the light of God flashes and brings fabulous things out of situations where there seems to be nothing but darkness and loss. What a difference a day makes. I had a man come into my office a long time ago in another area, and he sat in front of me and he talked to me about how crushed he was. He was about 50 years of age at the time, and he said, "Mark, my wife has told me she wants a divorce. She wants me to leave. I don't know what has happened. I don't know what's going on with her, but I want you to know that I'm crushed. And this has hurt me so deeply, and it's embarrassed me, it's humiliated me. And I am in such emotional pain, I'm thinking about taking my life." And the first thing I thought to say to him was, "Thank you for telling me this, because it really lets me know how deeply and how much you are in pain. And I'd want to know that as one who cares for you." And then gently I started talking to him about what? About the Easter story. About newness of life that God can bring out of situations where there doesn't seem to be any hope. Only despair and loss and darkness. I said, finally, give God a chance. Give Him some time to work His wonders in you and for you. Well, about 6 months later, I saw him show up one morning. After the divorce, I saw him show up one morning with a woman that I'd never met. And in a few months, he comes back into my office about a year or so later, sat in the same spot, and he said, "Mark," he said, "I want you to know I'm engaged to be married. I am so happy. I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. And I'm more thrilled than I can tell you." And I thought to myself, that's so God. The God of Easter. The God who brings newness of life where there doesn't seem to be any. If you're in the darkness, give God time to help you out of it and through it. He's not the God of darkness. He's the God of light. Erskine White tells about a woman who had been married for 4 months to an Army Ranger. They were in love. He was killed in a training exercise, and she was devastated. For months, Erskine says that she was more dead than alive. Her friends began to be very concerned about her. A significant time had passed, and she was still devastated. She went to church on Easter Sunday. She heard the message of how Mary and the women came to the tomb in tears, carrying with them the very symbols of death, expecting nothing but death and despair. To anoint a corpse with spices. And she heard about how the angel announced surprisingly that God had raised Jesus from the dead. She heard the Easter message. It made all the difference in the world for her because she embraced it. She claimed it for her own. She came out of this service and people were saying, "What's happened to you?" She said, "It's as a great burden has been lifted from my shoulders. Now I know I can go on living." And that's the message of Easter, one of its many messages, that you and I can acknowledge our fear, our loss, our challenges, and own them. But because of the God of Easter, we can exchange our fear for faith. We can exchange the sadness of Good Friday for the joy of Easter. We can take off our mourning garments and put on the garments of joy and praise and thanksgiving to God. Today is the day that we can move forward with life. We can go on because God is alive and God works His miracles in everyone who looks to Him for newness of life. We can now move into the future, into the unknown. And we can embrace mystery and risk and wonder because God in Christ goes before us. Charles Kingsley, in closing, was a very gifted Anglican preacher. There came a point in his life and in the life of his wife that they were both in the same hospital in different rooms, terminally ill. They would communicate with each other through notes. One day Charles received this note from his dying wife. "My darling, is it cowardly of me to shrink and to tremble before the mystery of the unknown? To tremble before the reality of death before me?" He wrote her a note back. It's the message of the angels. It's the message of the risen Christ to you. Do not be afraid. It will not be dark because God is light. There will be no loneliness or isolation there. For God is present. Christ is present. There will be light because of God. What a difference a day makes.